Well, I write about everything, and I've been publishing for a really long time, so it never occurred to me to not write this book and to not publish the book. And actually, one day my mom called me over to her hospital bed without my saying anything, and she said, "I'm giving you permission to write this story under one condition. Promise me you'll never make me read it." So I honored that. And for me, I love having this book in the world because I can talk about my mom, and writing the poems by myself, alone in my room, helped me feel really close to her. And actually, when I finished the book, that was hard because I felt like I was letting go of her all over again. So now, and it took about a year for the book to be birthed into the world. So now I get to go around and talk about her, and I feel like I have her close to me again in that way. So that's a nice experience for me.
Well, I grew up in a poetry desert, I guess, the poetry equivalent of a food desert. We didn't have books of poetry in my house. I don't remember poetry being taught in grade school. So I became accustomed to the idea that I was the only one who really cared about poetry. And of course I thought my poetry was quite wonderful from a very early age, and so I seemed to be the only reader that I needed. But I've never worried that, what if my parents read a poem about them? I actually did when I was in high school. I wrote a poem about my father. It was a mess at this certain time, and it had the line that felt riskiest to me. It started out, "My father is fat and cries a lot." And it seemed to me that those were the two most terrible things that I could say about my father, even both were kind of obvious and true. And I read them at readings, and my mother went to one of these readings. How the heck did I get her there? Was she just had to drive me or something? I was like 15. And she never said anything to me about it. So I never had the feeling that you had to worry about revealing anything private, because in my experience, well, he wouldn't read my poems at all. The only reaction that I remember getting from either of my parents to any of my poems was, if I told my mother that I'd written a poem about the Holocaust, she would start tearing up immediately and would continue crying through the poem, but she would start before the poem had started. So I wasn't sure it was my literary skill that was moving her.
Interesting. So, Joy, you didn't grow up with other poets, but did you look up to famous poets? Did you have poet role models?
When I was in high school, I did. I went to an alternative high school does anybody remember the CETA program?
Oh, sure.
So, one of the teachers at my school through the CETA program was a poet who'd been a draft dodger, and this was his way of re-entering. He was a very serious American poet, and to me, Allen Ginsberg was such a big deal that I thought that the way to be a popular kid in high school was to memorize Howl and recite it at parties. It turns out that's a way to clear the room.
What about you?
Well, I studied with Allen. So that's a very interesting connection. Well, first of all, one of the first poetry books that I was aware of was a book called Poems for the Little Ones that my uncle gave to my mother when she was 11. He was her big brother, and it said for Florence, something like a foundation brick to put in the cornerstone of your literary castle or something really amazing. And my mother wanted to be a writer. And she published one short story, which she never told me about, in her high school literary journal. And it was about a teenage girl who didn't get along with her mother. And she didn't even bother changing the name. It was Florence. And my aunt, who's not my mother's sister, is my mother's best friend, gave me this like 2 years before my mother died, and my mother never told me about it. And what happened was my grandmother read the story, and my mother never wrote again. And so my mother would not do that to me. So what she said, we had this long conversation about this, because I was like, how could you not tell me this, whatever, and then she said to me, as long as you write the truth, that's all that matters. But so when I was in high school, I also fell in love with the Beats, and I was determined to meet them. So I heard about the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, which is part of Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado. So being the true hippie girl, I hitchhiked out there and presented myself, and I said, I'm here to study. And Alan took me under his wing. Yeah, and he was my mentor. Yeah.
Were there any Jewish women poets that you read when you were coming up?
I love Denise Levertov, and I guess it's complicated to count her as a Jewish woman poet, but I certainly did.
For me, not till I came out as a lesbian, and then I started reading Irina Kleppish and Melanie K. Kantrovich, and Muriel Rukeyser, and all those fabulous poets.
Grace Paley?
Grace Paley, how could I studied with her as well. Yes, Grace Paley, and Joan Larkin, and many, many people.
So you both write in so many different mediums. You're not just poets. How is writing poetry different than writing memoir or writing children's books? Is it more personal?
This is really a you question.
You think? Well, from poetry is my first love, you know, and if someone said to me, you can only write one thing, I would definitely choose poetry. But to me, as long as I'm writing, I'm happy. There isn't that much of a difference, but I feel like I think every prose writer should study poetry and write poetry because you learn so much about language and sound and rhythm, and so I feel like my poetry really informs my prose. But I don't really find one form or the other that different. I mean, I put my heart and soul into whatever I'm writing. But you write in more than one genre. You write memoir and poetry.
I find prose easier than poetry.
Really?
But poetry is what makes me feel, I mean, I still have that childish feeling of something important happening, although at this point I know that the next time I read this, I will no longer have that feeling. But it still feels good, and it's really the same as when I was 7 or 8 years old.
Do either of you, or both, I suppose, consider yourself political writers?
I read, no, I heard Amos Oz, the Israeli novelist, speak at Princeton, and he was asked about why his novels aren't more political, and he said, look, when I have something to do with politics, I do it in the political form. By the time you publish a novel, whatever you were writing about politically has changed. He said the politics in literature is, you know, where you put the comma. But those choices are the consequential choices. But
I thought it was the semicolon.
that's for those of us who are anarchists. In the past year and a half or so, I've been trying to use the word whiteness in poetry as much as possible to see what happens. It's a word that I really didn't grow up with. You know, we were very, very white, and we never ever talked about it. So I wanted to try to use poetry to see if I can give that word meaning and place myself in relation to it and take ownership. And I don't know if that counts as political.
Well, you know, when I started writing poetry as an out lesbian with lesbian content in my poetry, I felt like that really was a political act. I mean, that was the early 80s. You know, and there was the whole lesbian feminist publishing scene and bookstores, and that was a real political movement that, you know, and I just thought that would keep going up and up and up, but it kind of went up and then it tanked. But I feel really honored that I was a part of that. And I feel like that was very political. And, you know, I didn't do it as a political act, but I suppose writing and publishing Heather Has Two Mommies on my own with a friend, you know, her desktop publishing business was a political act.